Thank you for joining us, everyone. I was also checking the attendance list, just scrolling through all of your names. I see some very familiar names there and some unfamiliar. So thank you for joining us. If you're new to our programming, my name's Amanda Burden. I'm the senior curator here at the Brandywine Museum of Art. And it's my pleasure to introduce this preview of an exhibition that opens this weekend at the Brandywine. Frank Stewart's Nexus, an American photographer's journey, 1960s to the present, will be open for members on Saturday and the public on Sunday. We have the distinct pleasure of having Ruth Fine, one of the exhibition's curators, here to lead us through this wonderful monographic exploration of a single photographer's life. And we are incredibly honored to be hosting this exhibition. Ruth brings such a distinguished career to this work that she's done with Frank Stewart. She has been honored by the College Art Association with the Alfred Barr Award. She has received the highest honor from the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art for her contributions to the field of American art, with 30 years of service to the National Gallery of Art. She's helped enlighten the public on careers of artists from Helen Frankenthaler to Frank Stewart to Norman Lewis, Georgia O'Keeffe, and so many others that we now think of as household names. The research that is the core of this exhibition was first presented at an exhibition at Harvard University, and then in this current format has been to 4 other museums, with the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., inaugurating the show last summer, then on to Naples, Florida, the Telfair in Savannah, Georgia, and the Brandywine is the closing institution. We're also so happy that Ruth is born in a native Philadelphian and lives here in Philadelphia. And so we kind of are welcoming her home, presenting this exhibition in her southeastern Pennsylvania region. So I want you to have as much time listening to Ruth's words of wisdom. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions throughout, we'll circle around to them in the end. But for now, I will say thank you so much for joining us. And Ruth, we are so ready to hear all of your thoughts on this Frank Stewart project.
Amanda, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I apologize at the beginning that I'm going to sound hoarse. I will be stopping to drink water periodically. And it's, of course, a thrill to have the Frank Stewart exhibition here outside of Philadelphia. Frank Stewart and I met in about 1998 when I was working on a Romare Bearden show, and Frank had worked with him a great deal over the last years of his life. And I went to talk with him about Romare Bearden. And at that time, we did a book together of Bearden's photographs, which I thought was quite wonderful, and we basically stayed in touch ever since. The exhibition is organized in categories that will come up as we go through the images here, and all of the images are identified by their title, date, medium, size, and who owns them. So I'm not going to give any of that information to you. That will be on your screen. Frank was born in 1949 in Memphis, Tennessee. In Nashville, Tennessee, where he spent the first years of his life, the first 5 years. Both of his parents were enrolled in college, and they split from each other shortly after Frank was born. He stayed there until his mother wanted to go to New York to be a model, to be a dancer. She was an extremely talented and beautiful woman who I had the great pleasure of meeting before she passed. And so he went to Memphis to live with his maternal grandmother and great-grandmother, and 3 of his mother's siblings who were just about the same age as he was. He stayed there for several years, and then he went to join his mother in New York and spent much of his life changing spaces from Memphis with his family to New York with his family to Chicago, where his father and paternal grandmother lived. And so his youth was spent very much on the road, and that's been a hallmark of his life ever since. The photograph on the left is a self-portrait. He's done many, many self-portraits, which would in themselves make a beautiful exhibition. In most of them, you can't really recognize him, but because he's hidden in shadows or he's in a reflection, but they've become a very important and ongoing aspect of his life. Why don't we go to the next slide? Mary. Mary?
I'm coming. Sorry, it just paused my share for some reason. I hit something wrong. So just give me a second here to. Not sure how to Okay, here we go. Let's share again. And why is it paused? All right, I'm going to just have to start over and share my screen again. Sorry about that. And we'll be able to go right to the next slide then. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. There we go.
His first photographs were made in 1963 at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He went there with his mother from New York, and she had a camera with her, and she wasn't using it, and so he took it from her and said he wanted to use it. He has said often that he had never seen such a large integrated crowd of people, because certainly the South that he grew up in was segregated. The Chicago he grew up in was fairly segregated, and the New York was as well, although they were each segregated in different ways. I found it amazing that much of what he did in these earliest photographs as a 14-year-old had to do with the things he continued throughout his life. He was very interested in the human interest aspect of things. He took very diverse compositions, some of them quite symmetrical, some of them from very strange angles. He wasn't anywhere near the podium where the speakers were, and so he felt he had to find other things to photograph, and so he did. And his quest as a photographer has been rooted in learning as much as he could about the roots of his African American and Native American traditions. He's best known for his jazz photographs because he was the lead photographer for jazz at Lincoln Center for many years, and also the lead photographer for the Savannah Music Festival, which he did again this year when it picked up again after being closed for COVID. Next slide, please. As I said, the exhibition is divided into sections, the first of which is rituals. And here are 3 photographs that are all early from 69, 72, and 76. And he talks about the Easter Sunday photograph as having been working at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where he worked for many years in various capacities, and he realized that somewhere outside on Easter Sunday, he was going to find women in their Easter bonnets, talking about how every year at Easter time, he would get some new special clothing and his family would all get their Easter bonnets. And so he walked a few blocks and found the women he was looking for with their Easter bonnets. Something that's very important in this photograph, I think, is seeing the formal qualities where you, in the lower half of the photograph, have the roundness of the bonnets themselves. And as you move up in space, you have a rectangular format to the forms that are going on. Stewart has always been absolutely involved with every inch of the surface of his photographs. There's only one instance in the exhibition, and there are very few instances otherwise, where he cropped a photograph, and that's the Chicago wedding on the right. This is a first state of that, well, not a first state, it's an early proof where he cropped the left-hand side off in the full negative. You have a greater space between the edge of the bride and the young lady she's telling a secret to, so that they are less focused on. And as he describes making this photograph, he was helping the mother of a friend of his, though, who was a lifelong friend and who actually offered me the best introduction to Southside Chicago I could have had, although unfortunately he's now passed. But Beau's mother was catering a wedding, and all of those friends were called in to help her. But as Frank says, he always has his camera with him, and so when he saw this, he knew there was a photograph to be taken, and he did. Many of the photographs are owned by people who have known Frank or have historical importance in the world of photography or the world of African American life. And so you might think about who the collectors are of these photographs. The one in the center, George in the Doorway, is the other image in the show, like Chicago Wedding, that is in the exhibition in two states or two photographs. This is an early print, a silver gelatin print, and there's a later print in the show that's a digital print or an inkjet print. And one of the things Frank has always said is how interested he is in the intelligence of the medium of photography. He first studied political science and was thinking about photography as a possible hobby. But then he came to see the Langston Hughes, the Carava collaboration, the Sweet Fly Paper of Life. And that was the first time he saw photographs of the Black community that he felt were taking them in their greatest sense of humanity, showing them as the wonderful individuals they were, as opposed to people being arrested for burglary or drugs or whatever. And so he decided he had to meet Roy DeCarava, and he did go to New York and meet him. And that was perhaps his greatest inspiration in going on with photography. He also was very close to Bobby Sengstack, whose family owned the Chicago Defender, most important African-American newspaper at the time. And he saw Bobby Sengstack's photographs, which were much larger than those March on Washington photographs. And it was the first time he'd actually seen photographs other than those that are developed in a drugstore. And so that made him think further about being a professional photographer. One of the things he got from DeCarava are the amazingly rich tonalities that you'll see in all of his work. He's really a master at giving the most heightened and dramatic and humane detail of whatever he's photographing. So can we go to the next slide, please? Another aspect of rituals, Frank refers to this as the best of American life and the worst of American life. The second line, when you're leaving the funeral, it's common in the African American community to have the second line where joyous music is played after the sadness of the origination of the funeral and starting life again. He was going through, he was on a fellowship actually when he took this Klan Rally Jackson photograph, a fellowship that allowed him to photograph in the South. And he was driving, I believe, from Louisville back to Memphis and drove through Jackson and saw a sign that said, there's going to be a Klan rally next week. And he thought, well, I'm not going to miss that. And so he drove on to Memphis, spent a few days with his family, and then drove back to Jackson and saw the Klan rally. And these people were a little late, though. They were kind of running to get where they were going. One of the things that makes clear that Frank isn't cropping his photographs are the black borders around the edges. That shows you that the entire photograph, as it was seen in the frame of the camera, is being photographed and as he sees it. Okay, why don't we do the next slide, please? The photograph on the right is the catalog cover of the exhibition. The photograph on the left was taken in 1972 when he was working in Chicago for summer school. And he saw the Black woman getting on the bus and the white woman sitting there in what I suppose one could call a rather snooty facial expression. And so he was making the contrast of these two women, but again, very much involved with the notion of the decisive moment, which was introduced to him by Henri Cartier-Bresson. And he also speaks about that he tries to catch the moment with the most sense of the mood, the intellectual, psychological content, as well as the visual content will be famously seen clearly. The one on the right, you see the two people quite intimate with, holding on to each other in various ways, but looking in opposite directions, holding a radio. And it's part of something called the Radio Player Series, the bus. It is very common still for Frank to work in series. Sometimes those series are confined. They may be all done within a year or two. And then there are other series that we'll see as we move forward that he's been doing from the beginning of his career until the present day. So series has very, very different meanings for him. Okay, why don't we do the next slide? One of the things that's really important is to spend time with these photographs. And of course, I'm talking at a rate that's not allowing you to spend time with the photographs. I hope everyone who's on the Zoom program will come to see the show and see how beautiful these objects are when you see them firsthand. Miles Davis's sister lived down the street from Frank's grandmother and father in Chicago. So he came to know Miles Davis when he was a very little kid. And Miles had a complicated life and he wasn't performing for a while. And this photograph is taken as Miles is coming back to performing. Frank speaks of it as thinking of him as a Christ figure looking down on everybody else from a higher position. And he's obviously standing on something because Miles was not that tall a person. He was able to get into the green room, which is where performers are before they actually go on stage, whatever kind of performers they are. And he didn't have a press pass. And so it was Miles' sister who saw Frank outside desperate to get in, and she arranged that he would go in. One of the things that Frank speaks about a lot is the intelligence of the media and the many ways you can do photographs that give you different kinds of results. And in this case, he was photographing off the flash of another person so that the kind of light he has is coming because it's bouncing off another person's light. This is one example where you see the owner of the photograph is Sir David and Lady A.J. in London, the great architect. And One of the things that also has been true of Frank's photography throughout his life is that he thinks of everything as a unique image. He feels that every time you make a photograph, you're printing it in a slightly different way. You may be using a more advanced method. You may be making it very small or very large. And it's very much the idea that Jasper Johns has always spoken, that if you change one thing in an image, you've changed everything. And Frank clearly believes that as well. This is one photograph that has been known in several different sizes, and the one that's actually in the exhibition is quite larger than 16 by 20, as this one here is. Next slide, please. We're still in rituals. The notion of call and response is important to African American culture. We'll see a photograph taken in Africa a bit later that actually has that as its name. But in the exhibition, one of the things we tried to do was to indicate that there are echoes throughout Frank's career of specific kinds of subjects. And so Only God to Watch My Back, that's a guy named Top Catter, TC, who had just gotten out of jail. And Frank bumped into him and said, I want to take your photograph. And he said, well, if you want to take my photograph, I want you to show me where I was shot, which is in his, as we're looking at this, the left arm in the back. And so he said, I'm going to take off my shirt. And he took off his shirt. And then he said, wait a minute, I need to put my most precious possession on the back. And that was the cross and the notion. And he said, it's only God to watch my back. The Goree Island Painter is done in 2006 as opposed to 1987, but you can see that they are certainly related in subject. Goree Island Painter was a painter. Goree Island is where many slaves left to go across the Atlantic. And he went up and he saw this person painting against this very colorful wall. And he immediately saw him as a very powerful Black man. And the fact that he's painting is not really important to Frank. It's the fact that he's a powerful Black man whose back is reflecting ideas that he had earlier in his career. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we moved into sound, taste, and touch, which in some ways is a subcategory of rituals. The sound has to do with the music, the jazz, the music that's been part of Frank's life all throughout. He started out being most aware of gospel singing and blues. Gospel singing all the Sunday on every Sunday, and the taste has to do with the importance of food. I think that's used in that sense, or not the good taste, bad taste quality, but he's a great barbecue chef, he's a great gumbo chef, and the notion of food is very important to him. And touch, of course, can be in every category. It can be love, it can be fighting, it can be affection, it can be holding your instrument. And the one on the photograph on the left, Blues and Abstract Reality, is taken. Frank was with Wynton Marsalis as his septet was breaking up and joining with the remainders of the Duke Ellington Band, and they together formed Jazz at Lincoln Center. And they went down to this photographer's to get their photograph taken, but they were waiting around and hanging out. And so Frank just decided to take this photograph, which is probably better than any that were taken by the formal photographer, but I've never seen any of those, so I can't be sure. But the idea of windows, the idea of reflections, the idea of pictures within pictures, the idea of round forms as in the chair and the stool are all formally important, and you'll see them throughout Frank's work. The round forms may be part of instruments, they may be bicycle wheels, they may be with women's hats. but it's important to think about the range of formal elements that are important to him. And Warm Daddy in the House of Swing, again from the 90s, is an inkjet print, not a gelatin silver print. And it's another photograph that was taken off of, the light was captured off the flash of another photographer's flashlight, which is part of what introduces the sense of movement that goes throughout the photograph. It too in the exhibition is quite large, although there are smaller versions of it as well. So why don't we go to the next one, I think. Another sound, taste, and touch. And another making use of what he knows about what happens in the world. Just as he went back to Jackson because he knew there was going to be a Klan rally, he knew that in Harlem there were street fairs, usually a couple every weekend. And so he would go to the police station to ask where, what streets people had taken licenses out for. And he figured if he went there, he would find something interesting to photograph. And so that's how he came upon this Youth in Harlem series, Man Dancing with Two Girls. Sorry for that misspelling. That should be TWO, not two. Apologize for that. But again, it's an inkjet print, which has very different kinds of gradations than a silver gelatin print, which tends to be somewhat more subtle. Stomping the Blues on the right has to do again with the notion of the second line that we saw earlier in the cemetery photograph. And it's another example of what I meant about trying to have something you see later in the exhibition, a reflection or an echo of something earlier in the exhibition. Wynton's about 35 years old here. And it's wonderful if you look through the photographs that he made of Wynton over the years, including several books that he's done with him. One I'll speak about a little more in a moment. You have a real history of Wynton. Wynton didn't like to fly, doesn't like to fly, and Frank would be one of two people that would drive him cross country while the other, the band, the musicians would be going in a van, a bus. And so they came to be quite close to each other, and Wynton was very supportive of Frank's career. He would occasionally say to him, "Are you getting enough time for your photographs?" And by that he meant the photographs that were not being done of the orchestra, but being done as he roamed the streets on his off hours. Wynton wrote a beautiful poem that's in the catalog, and it will be on the walls of the exhibition. And again, I recommend that you read it. It's a real tribute to Frank and a serious acknowledgement of how well they knew each other and how close they remain, even though they're not working together as they did for many, many years. Okay, let's go to the next. Another sound, taste, and touch. The Smoke and the Lovers is a photograph of a place in Memphis where Frank grew up, family worked there, and he and a writer, food historian, Eric Lowley, were wanting to do a book on barbecue. And the writer had to submit a chapter and Frank had to submit an image. And so this was the image that he submitted. And they did get the contract, and they traveled around the country for about 6 months, photographing barbecue wherever they could find it. Both of them having very strong opinions on what's good barbecue and what's not good barbecue. But many of the images in the book are not about, you don't see the barbecue in the images, and the Juneteenth image is part of the book on barbecue, and you can see it's called Juneteenth, which in recent years has been a national holiday, but certainly wasn't in 1993. And Nexus, Texas is very close to Galveston, which is about where the slaves found out in 1895 that in fact they had been freed 2 years ago. So it's an incredibly important place and date in African American history. And of course, there's a wonderful intimacy in being so close to the people who are dancing with each other. Frank, I don't think he thinks of himself as a fly on the wall, but he has very warm and I don't know if humble's the right word, but people that he's photographing know that he's really interested in them. And so wherever he goes, he either knows the people very well or he makes them comfortable with him so that he can have intimate photographs like Juneteenth 93. And these are certainly people he'd never seen before he took this photograph. So why don't we go to the next one. Okay, there are 3 sections of the show called Searching for Roots. One is Searching for Roots Africa, one is Searching for Roots the Caribbean or Cuba. It's varied various times. And one is Searching for Roots New Orleans. The photograph on the left is what I was talking about, call and response. He speaks of the drum as the instrument through which African Americans have always communicated with their neighbors or associated villages. And this is on Côte d'Ivoire, done in 1974, which was the first time he went to Africa. He went as a student at Cooper on an independent study program and visited Liberia, Nigeria, and Ghana and the Ivory Coast. And was there for a semester and did an amazing array of photographs. He didn't go back for several years, but he started going back in 1996 and has gone many times since then. Okay, so Clock of the Earth, Monthe, Ghana. The call and response is owned by George Nelson Preston. It was with George Nelson Preston that Frank first learned about African art and also has traveled to Africa on many occasions. In this town, Monthe, Ghana, the Clock of the Earth is the title because people wake up when the sun comes up and go to sleep when the sun goes down. There was no electricity when he was there. And in the morning and in the evening, these strong women, usually women with large vessels on their heads, walk to the well at the edge of town and bring back water for their work during the day and go at the end of the day to bring back water for their work during the evening. And one of the things I think is so beautiful there is its moodiness. I think these 3 photographs of Africa are a good comparison of Frank's work with the clear edges of the forms and the people in call and response, this very moody quality of Clock of the Earth. And then on the right, Chief's granddaughter, and he speaks that he was taken by this image because of the young grandchild looking directly at him, and also the geometry of the composition. The geometry of the composition is something that Stewart would have learned in some sense by osmosis from spending the time he did with Rover Bearden. So we should go on to the next one, please. Okay, Caribbean, not Cuba. Mainly the Caribbean is meaning Cuba. The first self-portrait was from the Dominican Republic. Most of the Caribbean shots are from Cuba. He was among the first group of photographers in 1997. There were 8 of them that traveled to Cuba under the auspices of the Center for Cuban Studies in New York, but at the invitation of the Cuban government. And they spent a month there seeing every aspect of life on the island. They traveled all over the island and saw hospitals and medical centers and factories, and really got to know the place. And he kind of fell in love with the place. And he speaks about how wherever you go, there's music in Havana, people are dancing. The Castro print, #1, we know why it's #1. We know who #1 is. And he was there, this is the next year in 78. And he was in a room and with a lot of people. And all of a sudden they were told, stay where you are. Nobody can get out. Nobody else can get in, and don't move. And 2 minutes later, Castro was right in front of him. So he just happened to be there. He didn't plan to be there, but he was lucky. And of course, Castro was speaking in Spanish, which is not Frank's strong suit, although I'm sure he understands a good bit of it by now. And he talks about, if you can't work it in, work it out. Or if you can't work it out, work it in. And I'm sure that's what he's talking about in working in the light, which is such a central piece, and then the equally central lights above. But somebody said, well, we have a quote from Frank that says, if you can't work it out, work it in. And then we have another one that says, if you can't work it in, work it out. Which one is correct? And I said, well, they're both correct. I said, dichotomy is one of the things that's been central to his work throughout his career. So we better go on to the next and move a little faster. Ellis and Wynton Marsalis, there are a number of photographs in the exhibition related to New Orleans. I'm going to show you a few others later. But this is Wynton Marsalis with his father, Ellis, in their home. And that kind of intimacy, again, is something that you don't find often. And so it's a very beautiful example of being in New Orleans and seeing something that almost no one else who visits New Orleans could possibly see. So let's move on to the next. There's a section of the exhibition called Drawings. And when I said earlier, Wynton asked Frank, are you getting enough of your own photographs? Well, whenever he would travel, he would take shots whenever he wasn't with the orchestra. And he came to think of them as drawings. Again, definitely the decisive moment behind them. Most of them are in color rather than black and white. He started doing them increasingly when he started working digitally. He did color photography all of his life, but it was too expensive to print the photographs he took in Africa. When he took them, he didn't have that kind of funds. And so now he's going back and printing some of the works he took in color in Africa. But we have Lisbon at the top, which is gelatin silver print, Cubism, Times Square, and then Cityscape. And you can just see the power of that composition, that light as it goes up, and the reflections that I mentioned earlier in the photo studio when he did the musicians. So he also went back and picked earlier black and white photographs that he said were precursors to the drawings, that the intention of them was very similar. So let's move on. One of the themes in the show is windows. The 3 partitions in the center is the earliest window he did in 1971. This is one of the series that he's continued today. The photograph on the left, Perugia, was the first photograph he took in a hotel room. Once he realized he was traveling with the orchestra everywhere and spending so much time in hotel rooms, he started being interested in looking out the windows. And so he started with Perugia in 96 and then continued and still is continuing to photograph, mainly from inside, looking outside. They are among the earliest works that he had printed on aluminum rather than on paper. The one in the center was a group of Italian bocce players in New Rochelle, Mount Vernon area where he was living in 71, right when he was starting art school. And they had plastic covering the windows so that to keep the cold out. There was nothing on the roof above them. So again, that's one of the ongoing series, several examples of which are in the exhibition. Let's move on, please. And then there's the subject of artist portraits. He started doing artist portraits in 1975, 76 when he was working with Carlton Moss and Johnny Simmons on a film that was to accompany the exhibition 2 Centuries of Black American Art that David Driscoll organized as the centennial exhibition for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which also traveled to Brooklyn. I believe it was Brooklyn, somewhere in New York. And so the Alma Thomas photograph comes from them, 1976. He's gone on to work, by artists. He means writers and musicians and visual artists. David Driscoll has been critical to the whole history of African American art, both as an art historian and as a curator and as an artist. And this is showing him with this collection in one of his homes. And then there's Bearden, which is an homage really to a photograph of Picasso Frank knew. He's a great reader. He's very, very knowledgeable on all aspects of art and politics and the world. And some of that, I think, is just native to who he is. And some of that was by spending so much time with Bearden, who was also a great reader and thinker. And so let's move on to the next. I'm very worried about time. I want to save time for questions. Since Katrina in 2005, issues of the environment, social practice have been very important to Frank's subject matter. He went with Wynton in 2005, back to New Orleans where his family was, and made many photographs of the flooded city. And you can see, if you look in the middle of the house at the right, there's a line going across the house, across the windows and across the door. And that shows you how high the water was at one point. There's something amazing about the cross that's formed at the bottom of this photograph and the reflection of the striped awnings into the water. In 2006, he photographed what was left of so many of the houses. They were devastated, but they still showed the elegance that they had when they were first taken. And let's move on to the next. I'm going to really hurry through these. The third year he went, which was 2007, he was very involved with photographing the Black churches, and that's where Hammond B3 comes in. And there were more than 100 Black churches before Katrina, and I think about 11 after Katrina, because there was nobody to come back and work with them. The people never did return. He also got involved with the island sinking off the coast of Louisiana, because the land was being dredged, and the islands were sinking. And so one of the things that's been important, let's move to the next, in his work with social practice, has been going to these places after the events. He doesn't go there when the fires are happening. He goes there after the fires, after the floods, after the islands are sinking. Makes a point of speaking to the people as much as he can. And as I said, he's so lovely and curious that people are happy to respond to him. And so these are California fire series. He just got in the car and drove to California and up the coast. And it's absolutely nothing for him to get in the car and drive across country, stopping where he feels necessary and when he feels necessary. But you can see from the same series, he has great vistas and very intimate sections and subjects. Let's go on to the next, please. Social practice, while it wasn't called, that was part of what he was involved with earlier on. These are 3 earlier examples just to show that he was involved with issues of slavery, involved with issues of animal rights, involved with issues of education. The print on the right, Girl Reading Monfigana, is owned by Johnny Simmons, who was his friend from childhood and the person he worked with on the film 2 Centuries of Black American Art. She's reading Braille. It's very worth looking at closely, as of course, as I said, are all of them. So let's move on. Cultures in color. Frank studied painting with Jack Wynton. And in addition to his studying with Jack Wynton, as I said, he just by osmosis learned from Beard. And he always talks about photography using terms related to painting, talking about brushstrokes, talking about the kind of mark making you get in paintings. The Savannah tour bus is an homage, although it's not called that, to Robert Frank, who was another photographer he greatly admired. Let's move on, please. And chromatic music. Things became very, very different once digital came on. The whole notion of what jazz photography could be was changed radically. The one on the right, Blood on the Fields, was the oratorio that Wynton Marsalis won a Pulitzer Prize for, and something that's been performed around the world. And Frank traveled around the world with it. Let's go to the next, please. Is that the last? No. Okay, so more chromatic music. God's Trombones is an annual event in Harlem. There's water at the very top, slightly to the right of center, which you may see splashing, being rebaptized. Circle in the Square, Savannah. The square, this is at the Savannah East St. Patrick's Day parade, which when he went to work on the music festival, he would go a few days early so he could see the St. Patrick's Day parade. There are 2 photographs in the exhibition of the parade. And Circle in the Square is where they're standing. The circle is the instrument he's holding. I think you can see his interest in abstract painting in the way the color is used around the circular instrument. So let's go on to the next, please. Okay, good. We're at the end. This is the largest photograph in the show. It's quite extraordinary. I think it will be at the end of the show. It's been at the end of the show in other installations and feels like taking a bow. And I think it also is a good sign of Frank Stewart's interest in formal issues, the circular balcony forms, the symbols behind the musicians as they bow, and they're kind of squeezed between the circular forms at the top and at the bottom. And so I think there's so much I didn't say, but you'll see it when you see it. And he very much believes that we all see in what we see, what we learn from our experience. We each come to look at any form of art based on where we're coming from, what our experience has been. And it's important to him. He doesn't want to give titles that lock things in a way that things can't be viewed very specifically by the observer and in a sense finished by the observer. So I hope you will all come and have a wonderful time observing. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruth. I wanted to kick things off as people are, thinking about their thoughts, questions they have, and something you mentioned there at the end about how digital really changed the way Frank or others, I suppose, were shooting jazz musicians. Do you know any more about Frank's decision to move to the digital world? Was he an early adopter? Does he still work in both media, or does he prefer one?
No, he works in both. I think he took up whatever he saw as being new when it came on the scene. He really, I think I said earlier that he believes in the intelligence of the media and that intelligence shifts with each technique, and also with each subject as well. But the thing with digital, I mean, it's very much more expensive to do film. You have to buy the film. You have to develop the film. You're not going to take 100 shots with film, whereas you might just take 100 with digital, and choose what seems best to you. And this fact that he doesn't crop, it's very important that what he shoots is what he wants to shoot, and he goes back to similar places or to very different places. But it was really the speed and the less costly aspect of it, but also much greater range of variety, the gelatins that could be used, and how you could make dramatic color in ways that you couldn't do when you were using film. So it's a matter of pushing as hard as he can.
Yeah, I think I remember another photographer mentioning, how a digital camera actually allowed them to be shooting color and black and white essentially at the same time without changing cameras, without changing film, because something that was color could be made black and white in the after process.
He usually has several cameras with him. He still shoots, 8x10 negatives. A lot of these California fire images are large negatives. And I don't know that I would say he prefers it, but it's important to him that he can deal with large negatives, that he deals with different kinds of film, that when you were dealing with film, the quality of the light would alter the kind of film that you needed. So commonly, I mean, the exhibition will have, I think, 6 or 7 of his cameras in the show. And he's not using these right now, but over the years, he did use all of them, and he used many of them simultaneously. And I have never seen him without a camera.
Actually, that's true. I've only met him twice in my life, both times in museums, and both times he had a camera. So that actually, I wanted to make sure folks knew, especially photography enthusiasts, that Frank has loaned 7 of his cameras to the exhibition. These date from throughout his career, different time periods and different formats. But also that brought up to me, the other thing that we find in cases that we didn't talk about too much today was a lot of the books that have been published with Frank's photographs. And you mentioned the Sweet Flypaper of Life earlier. So Frank did sort of a take on that in a publication with his own photographs as well. That's correct?
It was one of the first Kamoinga books.
Yes.
And Sasaki Shange doing the text, and Sweet Breath of Life. And again, it was an homage to the Carava for sure, and Langston Hughes. And he talks about how there weren't very many books you could buy that were about African American photographers. But early on in the 70s, there was a Black Photographers Journal. Recently, there's been a show devoted to that, or that it was included in. And he had a portfolio in one of those journals, but he would get whatever he could. Yeah, as I said, he's a great reader and a great looker.
And we will have a copy of the book dedicated to American barbecue that you can see the Smoke and the Lovers in. I'll be setting up that book actually a little bit later so that you can see the photograph as a framed work of art on the wall, but also the way that it is, you know, available really widely in a book that you could hold in your hand as well.
And most of his books can be found out there in the world.
I
Yeah.
checked quite a few available on Amazon. Yeah, I think it's an interesting aspect to be showing how these are works of art in an art museum, but also published works that people could see in other formats instead of being in a museum, you know, just flipping through them casually or owning them and having them on a bookshelf. So
It's common for many photographers that their work really is best known through the books.
I always think of that with Walker Evans. And, you know, it's interesting then to see how enlarging the photographs, as Frank has done with some of the, like the bow and some of those chromatic music works that we talked about, that scale becomes, you know, something that makes it very different from a publication. I think people are going to be really impressed when they see the power that these images have, and then the added power when they're at that larger scale. Mary, I'm going to do a little wrap up here, unless you have something else you need to throw in announcement wise.
No, I think we're good. I just wanted myself to thank Ruth for doing this talk. And also, Ruth, I really loved your comment about taking the time to really spend time with these images, because just even through this presentation today, I could see how rich they are in subject matter, content, and then the formal qualities and the subtlety of how they've been printed, all the decisions Frank has made. So I do encourage people to come and see this exhibition in person. I think it'll be really wonderful to have in our galleries this summer. So go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah,
And so I thank everybody for coming as well. And I hope that I did something useful to introduce you to the work.
Well, and I will just remind folks that are with us yet that the exhibition opens for members on Saturday, for the public on Sunday. And then Ruth and Frank will be joining us both in the gallery later in July 10th, to walk through sort of the real world version of what we just saw online. So I hope you all can come and see us, and everyone have a wonderful day, and try to stay cool out there, everyone. Goodbye.